The Myth of Jesus with David Fitzgerald.
You're watching the Myth of Jesus with Dave Fitzgerald, and I'm joined as always by Daniel Sanderson and Scott Heffler. And today we're joined by Jonathan Pearce, the noted philosopher, Tippling philosopher, and author.
David, can I just interrupt you there to say, look, when I meet some of my friends, like some of my geek friends, one of my best mates is a sort of philosophical mind like myself, a theologian, and we'll go down a pub and we'll be speaking for like 2 hours solid, because we'll just get round, we'll get a pint, sit down, and it'll be like this. It'll be like, blah, blah, blah. And then 2 hours later we say, oh, how's the family? How are you? Yeah. Are you all right? Yeah, I'm all right. It's like, that's not important. Like, our personal lives are not important.
I'm sorry, what's your name again? And how did we meet? Too funny. Well, on that note,
can you Photoshop me a nice face?
Oh, you got the nice face. Look, you've got the chops. You're almost the chairman of the beard here.
Oh, that's Isaac Asimov's level choppage.
Yeah.
So when I can't grow my hair upwards, I have to grow it outwards, right? I think the whole evolution of God, the whole idea is that it's a playground argument, isn't it? It's like initially God walked amongst us, and then someone said, well, my God's better than your God. Well, what can your God do? And well, my God's like your God, but he's got like an extra arm, or he's like a bit cooler, or he's a bit stronger. My God's stronger than yours. And it's like, my God's your God times infinity. Yeah, my God's your God times infinity plus one. And then like God just gets like shifted back behind the mountains, and then eventually God is abstracted outside of the universe until God literally is, the modern philosophical conception of God is that it's some abstraction that sits outside the universe and only explains a couple of things like consciousness and the beginning of the universe, but is basically this ineffable kind of abstract idea. And it's just this playground game that's just went too far until like my God is the most ultimate you can imagine, like literally the most incredible thing you can possibly imagine, not just some dude that's got a big penis or whatever, or some kind of way of being compared to someone else in a very like corporeal sense. It's like, I don't know why I had to bring in the phallus.
Yeah. Who wrote the song, my God could beat up your God could suck on my rod? Remember that?
I don't know, but I like the sound of it. That's interesting. And it's just these arguments that go, I mean, you can see that like that move to like monolatry, sort of from henotheism, the kind of like, how can my God be better than yours? Well, mine's all of your gods combined into one. Like, you can't get more supreme than just an individual God doing all the skills that your multiple gods can do. So I think what's interesting these days is that as we've abstracted God further and further away from corporeal reality outside of the universe, the modern Christian then has to, and this is why, Francesca Stavrakolopoulos' book, if I pronounce that correctly, is so interesting, God and Anatomy, is because modern Christians have to say, right, I believe in the Bible, especially if you're a biblical literalist, you say, I believe in the Bible, it's all true in some sense, or if I'm a literalist, it's all definitely 100% literally true. But I've now got this understanding of God that is this abstraction, this philosophical notion of God, but now I'm having to cohere that God and work out how that God works with regard to all the claims in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, that where God is clearly, far more corporeal and is not an abstraction, and is very much has human qualities, doesn't know where Adam and Eve are. X, Y, and Z. Plenty of examples in the Hebrew Bible where God is very much an anthropomorphic kind of ideal. And so, like, trying to marry those two ideas, I think is really problematic for the modern Christian.
In the same way, the inerrancy argument for the Bible, when you look at the things that happen in the various Gospels, for instance, you brought up in the book Matthew 27, where he talks about all the dead saints in Jerusalem come out of their graves and appear to many. I've had Christians accuse me of making a straw man argument just by repeating word for word what Matthew says in those two verses. And they try to make rational sense of that. And the answer you get is, oh, well, that's poetic license. Oh, that's biblical, this or that. You just don't understand how the Bible writings are. And
well, the problem is someone like Mike Licona does that, and then he loses his job.
Right. Exactly my point. But the fact is, you can see where the danger, the slippery slope for something is because if this part of the Bible, oh, well, that's just figurative language, that's just allegorical language, then where do you stop and how do you know the rest of it? or the whole
This
thing.
is exactly. So this is how we understand. I empathize with Christians because I can understand why you'd be a literalist, because it's quite simple. I've actually argued before that people like the Westboro Baptist Church, presuppositionalist type people, are logically more consistent because they just say, right, the Bible's true, end of, and I'm just going to believe it kind of literally all the way through, and it will take me wherever it takes me, which is, pretty heinous like opinions. But you're being consistent. The problem is, as soon as you let that chink in your armor, as soon as you say, right, well, this part is allegorical, this part is symbolic, this part's metaphorical, it's like, right, now I have to evaluate every single claim in the Bible to see whether it's literal and whether it's metaphorical, and how am I doing this, and how do I know I'm right? And as soon as that starts happening, to me, it's like a house of cards. And then when you're seriously entertaining the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, which is like obviously ahistorical and full of all sorts of different genres and all sorts of stuff, then it all falls apart.
Building on this idea of metaphor, there's this dichotomy between the particular. What if somebody were to say to you that the role of the Bible, the function of the Bible, has more to do with the putting guardrails in for the subjective experience?
What do you mean by that? Can you expand on that a bit?
Well, we could basically wave a magic wand and say that it's no longer called faith; it's now called pretend. But you take all the negative parts out of pretend, all the pejorative meanings of pretend, and equivocate it with something transcendent, the most beautiful feeling, whatever it is that gives the religious practice the feelings and the brain pattern, right?
Daniel, do you mean like doing some kind of version of like the Egypt game and that children's book, Zilpha Keatley Snyder, where the kids pretend to be Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, and they bring back basically the Egyptian religion, and it gives them some structure for life, even though they don't actually believe it, at least initially, but it gives them something to hang their hat on.
I think it's a more honest approach. I mean, I was watching an interview between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. It just came out, and basically it was very interesting because Peterson's wife was simultaneously in the morning practicing and participating in Sam's Waking Up podcast or app, and then also doing rosary bead prayers, I guess, right? Huh. And what does she do? She envisions Mary as, you envision it. This is totally an abstract, but fully accepting the truth of it being the abstraction, and understanding and using it as for the value that the story and the wisdom that comes out of it. And so he said that Sam, as a neuroscientist, said that you actually have a tactile, physical bridge of association between what you're make-believing and then also what this ritual act of felt, rosary rubbing. Right.
The question would be, how much does this need to connect to a historical underpinning or a historical understanding of the core text? So, this is very similar to what Raymond Brown, the very famous Catholic exegete, who produced two incredible volumes, The Birth of the Messiah, about the birth of Jesus, and The Death of the Messiah, about the death of Jesus, 2-volume work in the second one because there's a lot more data. His idea was, broadly speaking, as a Catholic exegete, that historically, I'm not too sure they really happened, or at least not how they're reported in the Gospels, and that's really controversial. But he then said, but it's a kind of dramatization of the events, but it's delivering a theological verisimilitude. And my problem, and I wrote a book, The Nativity, a Critical Examination, before I wrote The Resurrection, a Critical Examination, both books of which David has written the forwards for, so he's a bit of a legend. But the problem I have with that is, like, what are you hanging that on? So if you're saying this is delivering some kind of truth, some kind of theological truth, it's maybe slightly different. If like you're saying, Daniel, you're saying it's giving me a maybe a moral truth, a bit like the Good Samaritan. It doesn't matter whether that story is true, but I can extract some moral truth from that, or some kind of psychological comfort. Fair enough. It doesn't really matter whether it's true. But if you're saying things like Jesus is the Messiah, then actually that carries a lot of theology, and it carries a lot of historical context of what a Messiah is and what Messiah means. So if you're saying that there is theological verisimilitude in Jesus's life and death. And then you're saying, but actually these events didn't really happen. Either they didn't happen at all, or they didn't happen like they said in the Bible. Then what you're doing is you're hanging your theological coat on a coat hook that is no longer there, and then it just falls to the ground. And so I have a bit of a problem with that. Like, you need the historical basis in order for the theology to have purchase.
Well, okay, so let me throw a hiccup in that then. Just as not that I'm disagreeing with you here, okay? But help me defend the is ought then, because deriving one from the other, and you can't get to an is without some sort of substrate of imagined something, right? I mean, how do you get to the is? That's the big question that seems to be.
What do you mean here? Can you expand that a bit?
Well, basically, a religious argument is that you can derive an is from an ought, right? And so you can make a fundamental claim on morality as being something real in the world, right? And so, if you're just deriving ises, then you're going to say, from what do you derive the is from? Does it come from our prefrontal cortex or ability to abstract? Then which do we abstract and which do we not abstract?
Well, I mean,
the argument,
yeah.
Right?
Well,
We're getting we understand all of the baggage that comes with religion. And I think that's the only reason why I'm pushing you guys here just for a minute. And then I do want to get into the books, particularly starting with the Nativity one and then moving to the resurrection one, because that's the order in which you wrote them. But this is the reason why I challenge you guys on this, is that it's not the trajectory that you guys write about. And I'm wondering how much you actually think about this. If all of a sudden the Pope stood up and said, hey, you know what, this is all a myth.
So I think about this a massive amount. I think about this a massive amount. In fact, so my latest book, other than the one that's just about to come out, is Why I Am Atheist and Not a Theist: How to Do Knowledge, Meaning and Morality in a Godless World. Right. And I'm trying to build up my entire worldview from the bottom up, which is starting with ontology, going through epistemology to natural theology to teleology to morality. Right. And then saying, right, this is all the bricks are in place. This is why I believe what I do. And actually morality comes last. So when you're talking about divine morality, or when you're talking about morality in a theological sense or theistic morality, I would be doing exactly what you're talking about, which is like, how are you deriving your morality when I think I can show you that the ontology of abstract objects is mind dependent. So if all sentient creatures in the world died, we wouldn't have any concepts at all. They are whether that be what a chair is, whether that be what a hero is, whether that be what morality, loyalty, mathematics, all of these are constructed by the conceiver. So this is actually how I would go about challenging a lot of theists who talk. They start at the conclusion and try and work back. Whereas I'd say, let's start at the basics. What is the ontology of abstract ideas? Because I'm a conceptual nonist, which is like philosophical jargon for saying that actually I don't believe in universals, or I believe that when we conceive abstract ideas, we are constructing them conceptually in our heads. And when we agree, it's because we have similar cultures, similar brains, and similar experiences, or we can communicate ideas across time and space, et cetera, et cetera. But we are constructing these things ourselves. And that's not only do I say that makes sense philosophically, but when you look at the world around us, that clearly appears to be what has happened. I say clearly appears. It appears to be what has happened throughout time and throughout history and geography, which is why we disagree on areas of everything, whether it be law and morality or this or that, is because we are constructing these things up over time, and there isn't some platonic ether where these things exist 100%, and we're delving into that. Because even if that did exist, how do we know that we're getting the right things out there and that we're reflecting that platonic ether accurately or not? But so you're right. I kind of agree with you, Daniel, but I would say that actually that pulls the rug out from under theists.
Yeah. I was brilliant. I really like that explanation. I think you have given that some thought.
I like the comment we were on a little bit earlier, which is people that take the Bible seriously and literally, and therefore have to be consistent about all the strange things in it, like the Westboro Baptist Church. Although I don't know if they're really consistent because they probably work on Saturdays and eat shrimp and stuff like that. Have you guys seen the letter to Dr. Laura?
Yes.
Oh, it's a masterpiece. He's writing Dr. Laura Schlesinger, which is a former BDSM kind of like who became a talk show host, and then she became an Orthodox Jew. And it was just part of her, her self-marketing shtick. And so one of her fans wrote a letter and said he has some questions because he's also recently converted. And he wants to know, when he burns a bull on the altar as a sacrifice, I know it creates a pleasing odor for the Lord. The problem is my neighbors. They claim that the odor is not pleasing to them. How should I kill them? I would like to sell my daughter into slavery as sanctioned in Exodus. In this day and age, what do you think would be the fair price for her? I know that I'm allowed no contact with a woman while she's having her period. The problem is, how do I tell? I've tried asking, but most women take offense. Leviticus states that I may indeed possess slaves, male and female, provided they are purchased from neighboring nations. A friend of mine claims that this applies to Mexicans, but not Canadians. Can you clarify? Why can't I own Canadians? And he just goes down the list. And then these aren't the hard parts. The hard parts are the shrimp. Let's see here.
But you're right. There are 613 mitzvah in the Hebrew Bible, which are these laws, and what Christians do, for example, is they say, well, Jesus there's a new covenant. He replaces all those laws.
Right, that's Peter makes all food clean. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But here's Acts. But what really struck me is the art when it comes to depicting. Because that would be the closest thing, because you have this bizarre metaphysical reality, and then you have all these mediations. Then you have people like Peterson, who's really just working for the right in this weird marriage between evangelicalism and republicanism and the capitalism in the U.S. But he tries to say what Daniel was just saying. We need to believe the myth anyway, because if we don't, humans are too chaotic. So we need to just kind of ironically suck up to whatever the dominant myth is, and then that'll help us get along together and play nice, and also provide some good tips for moral life and all this.
Except when it doesn't.
Yeah, exactly.
But it seems to me that the most interesting thing is the art. So has anyone seen these biblically accurate angel?
Oh,
have you seen this? Let me share this image here.
They're horrifying. Yeah, here we go. I don't know if you can make it out, but there's a tiny human being at the bottom of the picture being stared at by these giant eyeballs, surrounded by giant eyeballs. And wings, of course.
That's horrible.
Yeah. It's almost H.P. Lovecraftian.
This is so I've only got one phobia, right? And I've just found out recently what it's called, and I think it's called trypophobia. And it's a fear of like holes, like arranged in ways. And literally, I have it so bad, it makes my brain fizz. And
of holes.
Like geometric. So so I can be boiling macaroni, and sometimes it stands up all on the end and pokes all pointing upwards. And I look down and I'm like, oh, that's horrible.
How are you with fractals? Because I have this kind of vertigo phobia about when I look at fractals too long and they seem to be splitting off, I suddenly get this feeling like I'm falling into them beyond all time, space, and meaning, and it's horrifying.
That's more of probably a perceptual one, whereas I think this is rooted in I think there's evolutionary psychology behind this that suggests it's to do with how diseases might look and blah blah blah. But there are pictures you can get online with like people's hands with holes in, and honestly, it makes me freak out big time. But I was wondering about that. I'm going to write an article on this because this then made me, because as I was saying with Daniel, I can't get through like thinking about anything without like then looking at it philosophically or theologically, which is like, okay, I can understand this phobia in this thing freaking me out because there's some evolutionary heritage to do with the fact that this kind of triggers ideas of this thing might be diseased, right? And therefore I need to keep away from that. So I understand that kind of like thinking. How do I understand it in terms of God? Like, if God exists, why do phobias exist? Like phobias in general. And actually, so I'm going to write a piece that's going to be the argument from phobias, which is like, actually, phobias. So what? Again, it's almost like the cumulative case. Someone like Draper, who says Paul Draper, who says like atheism. If you look at the inference to the best explanation, you start like saying, well, does this better suppose atheism or theism? Does this better suppose atheism? And you look at something like phobias. Now, it's not going to disprove or prove God, but it's like, what does it better favour? Theism or atheism? What? Atheism, like, because I can't for the life of me think why God would introduce phobias into humanity of all the different varieties of phobias. And that's just bloody horrible.
It is a bit. John, have you read Daniel Dennett's book, Breaking the Spell?
No, but it's a book that's always been on my list.
It's fascinating in the way that he describes all these evolutionary survival mechanisms that are so easily co-opted into religions, and shows how things like, just agency detection leads to so many other things. And just the fact that we're social animals gives us this whole raft of different evolutionary survival mechanisms, and how well they get, composed onto a religious framework.
And aren't those all compatible with the deistic God? You could say that God just set up the physical, the fundamental physics laws, and then this left and let natural selection give us those imprints.
Yeah, absolutely right.
He's so patient, it's like he's almost not there at all. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I was going to say that deism is effectively functionally the same as atheism. That kind of so that I would just say yes, it's not disconfirmed by deism. Or
gotcha.
Okay, well, I want to ask a couple questions about the sequence of events that led to the Nativity book and then also the Resurrection book. So what was your mindset when you started with the Nativity? I mean, it's a critical examination. I see it's a second edition with the first one in 2012. What was your mindset? What was the impetus? Where was your career and philosophical mind at when you sat down to write this book? And then secondly, answer this is, did you have much research or knowledge about the resurrection when you had written the Nativity, or did that kind of come sequentially in terms of your research?
Oh, great questions. So going back all that time, I'd written a couple of books by the Nativity book, and I'd been arguing about the Nativity. I wonder. I'm struggling to remember now. Probably because the Nativity is quite an easy thing to argue about. Because actually, I think it is quite easy pickings. I think it's easy pickings for atheists, precisely because the claims are only in two of the Gospels, and they are so problematic. And those two Gospels clearly contradict. I mean, I don't care what theists and apologists say, they contradict each other, quite openly. And so in doing that, and whenever I think and argue about stuff and write blog pieces or argue with friends, I might as well kill two birds. I'm always thinking about books and how because in writing a book, you're generating your own idea, or you're reflecting on ideas, and you're improving your own thoughts and conclusions and what have you. And so that just ended in me writing that book and then researching that over that time. And I still stand with all the claims. In fact, I just add a couple more now, even though I only recently looked at that book again, I could even add a couple more arguments in there still. But at the time, I didn't really have the knowledge of I didn't remotely have the knowledge of the resurrection that I do now, because I really went to town on looking at the resurrection, but looking at it in the same sort of vein. But the books are, in the same way that I mentioned Raymond Brown, his Death of the Messiah is twice as big as his Birth of the Messiah. My Resurrection book is twice as big as my Nativity book. And that's because of really, if you're a Christian, you could probably drop the Nativity quite easily and still be pretty much the same Christian. I think there's a few issues, but broadly speaking, because it's really all about the resurrection. So that's why there's so much more thought is put into defending the resurrection than defending the Nativity.
Yeah, because you could get away with saying, oh, that's just legendary embellishment that came later. Resurrection, not so much. It's a lot more writing on that.
I think the problem you have with the Nativity is probably looking at Matthew, who says that these events predict or prophesy Jesus' messianic nature. And if you're then saying, like, going back to the problem I had with Brown is what do you hang your coat on? Like, if you're saying that these things didn't happen, then how are you saying that Jesus is the Messiah if he didn't come out of Egypt in the same way that because Luke has, I mean, this is going into a whole different discussion that I haven't given the groundwork for, but basically Luke, okay, how do I say this really quickly? Right. Okay. Jesus is Jesus of Nazareth, right? So he's up in Nazareth. And I think what's going on is that he was known as Jesus of Nazareth later. So that's what people accepted him as, because that's where he lived. But both Luke and Matthew go through the Old Testament looking at prophecies and think that Jesus needs to be born in Bethlehem because that's what the prophecy supposedly says. So they both have to get him being born in Bethlehem, but living in Nazareth. And Luke and Matthew do this in entirely different ways. So Luke has Mary and Joseph already living in Nazareth and then traveling down for a census and then going straight back via Jerusalem, straight back. There's no doubt about this. It's very clear, straight back to Nazareth via Jerusalem. Matthew it appears probably already living in Bethlehem, then Herod getting involved, chasing them out of Bethlehem and going to Egypt as political refugees for probably a couple of years, and then returning to eventually Nazareth out of Egypt. And this coming out of Egypt is what is fulfilling a prophecy: out of Israel, out of Egypt, I will call my son Israel. And Matthew has them coming out of Egypt to fulfill this prophecy and then returning to Nazareth. And these two narratives just don't marry. But
wait one moment. I've been biting my tongue throughout just this simple explanation because there's so much more wrong with just that you've just told us. Yeah, the contradictions dogpile on each other so fast. Even calling him Jesus of Nazareth is hugely problematic. Yeah, it's like, yeah, but go on.
Yeah, well, because and this is what I mean. I just literally got shivers. I've got goosebumps. I love talking about the Nativity because every claim is a problem. Like it's just you can just take Luke and say, right, all of this is a problem. You can take Matthew, all of this is a problem. Yeah, and you can say, and now when we compare them, all of these are problems. And it's just a massive set of issues that. So then to go back to the original point that I was trying to make is that Matthew there is saying that Jesus is a Messiah because he comes out of Egypt to fulfill this prophecy and other instances of prophecy fulfillment. Sure. He's saying, well, if that didn't happen, then how are you telling me that Jesus is the Messiah? What does it mean for Jesus to be the Messiah? Because Messiahs, as we understand them, should be bringing about the Messianic age in the Jewish context, which is the peace to Israel and all its neighbors. And yet, what happens after Jesus dies? Well, Jerusalem is sacked and Israel is a scene of conflict for the next 2,000 years. So he's not a Messiah by the data we've got about Jesus, the area after Jesus died, and he's not a Messiah because the Nativity didn't happen. So how are you telling me he's a Messiah? Well, where are you getting that from?
Right. Yeah, the whole thing is problematic right from the get-go.
I like how he pulled in the modern day versus the 2,000 year lead up to the modern day of continual struggle. Like by what? I mean, there's fine. Even stepping out of the history and looking at the real world right now today, saying, why is it a Messiah? Even from an inspirational standpoint.
Yeah. But this is the tension you get between Christianity and Judaism, which is how much is Christianity a product of, or how much is it literally Jewish? Is it a Jewish sect? And what you had over the 400 years after Jesus died is this kind of attempt to extract Jesus from Judaism. And you can see this in the Gospel of John, and like clearly the Jews are blamed. The Roman Pilate said, who shall I let off free? And the Jewish crowd say, well, Jesus Barabbas. And it's like, okay, so on your heads be it. So the Jews are the ones that sentenced Jesus to death, and Pilate and the Romans are like, and then you're thinking, well, is that because the gospel writers are trying to extract Jesus from Judaism? Is it because they're trying to market the Messiah to the Roman Empire? Is it both of these things? What's going on here? And but there is this tension between like how Jewish Christianity is, and we go back to those 613 laws, and we go, Jesus saying, I will fulfill every jot and tittle of the law, but are you? Is this what's what's going on? How, bad. It's all a bit crazy.
It is. And it's fascinating the way they can have their cake and eat it too, in that, oh, this is the Jewish Messiah, and yet he's thrown out everything that came before him.
That was what I forgot. I talked myself into circles then. So the point here is that the Jewish Messiah, there are disagreements in Judaism over what the Messiah should look like. Does it look like a high priest? Does it look like a military leader? But there are certain excerpts from the Hebrew Bible that are very clearly talking about the messianic quality, the qualities of the Messiah. Yeah. And Jesus is none of those things. Yeah. Jesus does not fulfill any of the characteristics of the Jewish Messiah. So, and Christians say, well, we're just kind of like, it's a new Messiah, it's a different kind of Messiah. And they're just like reinventing this idea of what the Messiah is. So then how is Jesus fulfilling every jot and tittle of the law? How, you've got this tension that's going on where Christians are trying to claim that this extracted, cherry-picked verse says he's a Messiah. This cherry-picked verse says he's a Messiah. This cherry-picked verse says he's a Messiah. But none of the rest of it actually refers to Jesus. Okay, it says he's a Messiah. Is he the Messiah? No, he's a different kind of Messiah. Well,
and we could spend a whole hour just talking about the different prophecies they supposedly pull out of imagination, out of some totally out of context, something that's not even talking about the Messiah. It's like the 6 or 7 different types of contextual errors they make in trying to pull this scriptural collage of scraps into
like the suffering servant from Isaiah, which has nothing to do with the kingly or Torah interpreting qualities of a traditional Messiah. It's just and even my hands and feet like a lion.
Right.
That has nothing to do with nails. It just go all the way with it. So it's this, like Nietzsche said, when you go to church and you're trained to see every twig and every bird as a sign of Christ, you just become a bad reader.
Yeah.
Well, part of the problem here is the reliance of the gospel writers on the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And this is where you get, problems with virgin, problems with pinned hands rather than nailed. Is it a lion pinning your hands down, or is it? And even nail, it's actually dug anyway. So the verb as translated, I think, in the Gospels is dug, which is really tenuous to get from dug to nailed.
And when you take that verse out of the context, that whole chapter it's from, there's nothing messianic about it whatsoever. And there's just as many verses about drowning and bulls and things that have nothing to do.
So I have a question about the dug, because this is I can't leave that. So the idea, the images are of nailed, right? And everybody gets that, right? But if it's dug, explain to me what the image of dug would be. Like what I understand what the images of nailed is, but what does dug look like?
Well, when we say nailed, we're talking about like his hands pierced by trying to fend off a lion or wild dogs, that kind of thing we're talking about. They turn this natural depiction into them describing nails being pulled into his hands, is what we're saying.
Really?
Yeah.
It's just really tenuous. And in fact, there are huge amounts of arguments over, so much ink has been spilled just on that one line.
Sure.
And it's translation or mistranslation.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like Parthenos and Alma. So Alma is the Hebrew word for
young woman. Yeah.
And the Septuagint, the Greek translation, translates that specifically as virgin.
Right.
And Alma definitely means young woman, and it does in that context as well. And so therefore you get the kind of misunderstanding that this prophecy or part of the Hebrew Bible is talking about a young woman. You get this idea that it's talking about a virgin, and that's what the gospel writers then run with the virgin birth. And it's like, well, if that's a mistranslation from the start, then you're doomed to failure.
And it's interesting that Mark puts in all these scriptural allusions, but doesn't tell you that's what he's doing. He expects his readers to either know what he's doing or accept it as a nice story without knowing about the higher messages he's encoding into it. Where Matthew is the one who goes back and says, and this was because of this scripture, this because of this scripture. Even when you say that the connections he's trying to make are super tenuous or completely wrong or farcical or non-existent.
So just to go back to what Daniel was asking, so is it Psalm 22 where they say, "For dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers has encompassed me, they pierced my hands and my feet." Whereas actually the pierced, the English translation pierced, is a problem because I think it should better be translated as dug. But then people are now saying, well, actually, it should really be entirely translated as, "Yes, wild dogs surround me, a gang of evil men crowd around me, like a lion they pin my hands and feet." And so if that's the real translation of what that should be, then what the hell are they doing applying this to Jesus? It completely doesn't apply to Jesus, but this is supposedly a prophetic text that validates the crucifixion of Jesus as the crucifixion of the Messiah and something that prophesied from the Old Testament.
And we can multiply examples like that throughout all the Gospels from start to finish.
Well, and what's really interesting about that, though, David and Jonathan, is that it's actually speaking to the metaphor, that the metaphor just doesn't make sense. So you're hammering even that. To me, that's the loosest, the weakest defense that it's like the last line of defense for the theological argument is that, well, it's just a metaphor, just wisdom in that. Well, but the wisdom doesn't make sense. If it literally, the metaphor doesn't make sense. And we know this even from storytelling. We know that there's some sort of like, it has to add up, not in a mathematical sense, but it has to have some sort of like cohesive logical string that shows some sort of lesson or wisdom or something.
That comes at the end of the story. So imagine that MVP in football means a really good football player, not someone who's arrested during the ceremonies and busted for drugs by the police. Can you imagine if there was an MVP ceremony and the police came on the football field and they took the guy away in handcuffs? But you could tell a story about how all this time the MVP was just a sign of this person who's going to be arrested for drugs and taken away and put in jail. And it would just change the meaning of the term over time. And that's what they did here. The Messiah and a person who's crucified they have nothing in common. But you could, like, for example, but look, man, by being arrested and getting out of the field, it takes that MVP out and puts him out into the world. And now he's beyond the stadium. And he's the MVP for everyone. He couldn't have been MVP for everyone if he wasn't arrested.
And next year, that'll be our halftime show. Jesus,
mental contortions that we can do. But just to go back to what Daniel was sort of alluding to in terms of puns, there are a couple of instances in the New Testament, and I do apologize. My memory, I've got multiple sclerosis, and my short-term memory and medium-term memory is pretty shafted these days. But there's a couple of points in the New Testament where, understanding that most Christians believe that what Jesus says in the New Testament is what he said. You know, this kind of hyper-literalist understanding, which is problematic because there's no historical book. There's no book in the history of books that have ever been written, like in the history of the entire world, that anyone would agree are one-to-one representations of things that have happened.
Yeah.
Right. And just think about this. I think we forget this. Like, there's no history book that's ever been written that you say, when I read this, like 100%, this is what happened. Like, and when you start getting speech in there, like, who's recording speech? Who's standing there with a chisel and slate or like a dictaphone, like going, "Oh, say that again, Jesus. I didn't quite catch that," in that private conversation you're having with Pilate. And
not only that, but it's all in Greek, so it would have been in Aramaic for starters. So right from out of the box, we've got a problem. Yeah.
This brings me back to my initial point. Was going to be there are a couple of instances in the New Testament where Jesus says things that are really clever puns, but they are only puns that work in Greek. Yes. And in fact, it's impossible to make those puns work in English or Aramaic. Right. And I was reading some Bart Ehrman where he's like, gives the example of these. I was like, yes, that's brilliant. I must remember that, and subsequently forgotten it. But and this is so there you have a great example that shows that they must have been making this stuff up. These are later Greek writers, not getting received Aramaic or whatever Hebrew language idea of what Jesus actually said, but they are creating what Jesus said out
out of whole cloth,
their own whole cloth, and doing it in Greek and making these clever puns in Greek that work really well, but just wouldn't have worked in any other language.
And not only that, and when I say whole cloth, I mean whole cloth from scriptures, not completely off the top of their head. But another thing about that, just to dovetail on that, is also the names of characters and the names of the places where these stories and incidents take place are also incredibly apt if you know Greek. And we've got a whole list of that where, well, even getting back to Barabbas, the Barabbas story, Barabbas in Aramaic means son of the father. And I think we've talked about this on the show before, that you've got this situation where you have two Jesus, Barabbas and Jesus of Nazareth, two sons of the father. It's a whole Yom Kippur analogy.
Yeah, I love the Yom Kippur. For those, and you've talked about this before, but I say it again for any listeners, the Yom Kippur is the Jewish ritual of atonement. Okay, so already we've got some interesting similarities going on here. Yeah. So we've got a ritual of atonement. And you've got the high priest would take in two identical goats, and they have to be as identical as twins. They have to be really similar goats. One goat is let go, the scapegoat is allowed to go free into the wilderness, and that is freed. And the other goat is sacrificed. And then there's also ideas that around the goat is tied a scarlet ribbon, and even I think there's evidence of thorns, a band of thorns around the goat and stuff. Like this.
Yeah, a crown of thorns, if you will. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so then you start looking at the Jesus story and you say, right, you've got Jesus, son of the Father, and Jesus, son of the Father, and you've got the high priest Pilate letting one go, and one is sentenced to death.
Bearing the sins of sedition and murder with him, just like the people of Israel. Yep.
So the atoning for the sins of humanity. One is crucified with a crown of thorns and a scarlet robe, and both called Jesus, son of the Father. And you if the whole resurrection story isn't just a retelling of the Yom Kippur ritual, then bingo, whatever.
And if not, it's an incredible coincidence, because at every single point in that story, it makes no sense historically or what we know of Judaism. It violates just basic 101 day one stuff throughout the whole story. It makes no sense whatsoever. And yet, at every single point, it works perfectly as an allegory.
Yeah, and so right throughout my resurrection book, I talk about this is theology, not history, and I keep repeating it. It's theology, not history. And if you understand this story as a theological story, it's brilliant. I mean, this is brilliant. This is great writing. The four Gospels together, as different as they are theologically, and you've got John doing a different thing to the Synoptics Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's telling a different theological story where Jesus literally is the paschal lamb, the sacrificial lamb, whereas the other three aren't. This is not happening on Passover for them, but it is for John. And so they are telling different things, but together these are incredible bits of symbolic literature that I think are brilliant. But they're not telling the truth. They're doing theology right from the beginning. I mean, so David in his Nail book has, and I nicked a bit from that. So thank you, David, to do with the capture and trial. So the trial is unbelievably ahistorical.
Yep.
Like, it just didn't happen for a whole bunch of literally every aspect of the trial is.
And it was obviously written by somebody who had no idea how these trials actually work. For instance, having the high priest be the prosecuting attorney doesn't work for so many reasons, including the fact that Jewish trials did not have prosecuting attorneys. Full stop. Boom.
Well, and I always get comment on this about with Jesus actually being crucified. If he was in the position that he was, like in violation with the Jewish traditions, he would have been stoned to death. Wasn't that the case?
Yeah.
He would have been stoned to death for blasphemy, but the thing is, declaring yourself to be the Messiah was not blasphemous. People did it all the time, but especially during the first century. After Jesus' death, the Bar Kokhba revolt was all that. It wasn't against Jewish law. It wasn't against Roman law to declare yourself the Messiah. Yeah.
But I would agree with what Daniel says, and I think the most likely explanation, or most likely theory of what would have happened to him is he would have been stoned. I mean, we've got a lot of we can refer to the Mishnah, we can refer to Josephus, we can refer to the Gospels and Acts themselves. I think Acts has is it Stephen getting stoned to death for blasphemy? Or
yes.
So
but here's the thing: the charges of blasphemy, as the Christians are portraying it, don't don't comport to what we know about Jewish blasphemy laws, is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, the point is taken. If he was guilty of blasphemy, they would have stoned him to death.
Yeah, and hung up on a tree. So this is where you get, as a deterrent, but would have been taken down by sunset in accordance with Jewish law. So I think I do agree he would have been taken down, but he would have been stoned, hung up, and then buried in a criminal's graveyard. So
right. One thing I love about this book is, even though Jonathan leans more to the historicist side and I lean more to the mythicist side, what I love about it is he takes this and says, okay, we're not going to a priori rule out miracles. We're just going to say, could this have happened as described? And he lays down the gauntlet to Christians and says, okay, this is what your book is saying. This is how it happened. This is how this doesn't quite hold up. And I just really, my hat's off to you for that.
Yeah, no, and thank you. And you're absolutely right what you said earlier, that literally every single element of the resurrection story is problematic. Literally every verse can be contested. In fact, I've got Michael Alter's book just there. I could go and get it. It's like that thick. It's 1,000 pages where he's done exactly that, which is where he goes, every single claim is contestable and doesn't make sense for this reason, this reason.
And not just the miraculous things, but even totally mundane parts of his life, from his birth to his death and beyond, you know.
So to answer Daniel's earlier question, sort of in marrying these two up. So what's my thought? Because I'm actually writing a book on the Exodus now, which is a critical examination of the Moses story. And so what I did with the Nativity, so which way around can you see this? So is this going to be the beginning? So the Nativity is the beginning of Jesus' life and the resurrection is the end of Jesus' life. And these are the only two areas of Jesus' life that intersect with known history. So in the Nativity, you've got Pilate, you've got a census, you've got Herod. Oh, no, not Pilate. You've got Herod, census, so on and so forth in the Nativity. And in the resurrection, you've got Pilate and you've got death and burial, or execution and burial rituals and customs. So you've got known history, right? They fail. Like all the claims fail.
Yeah.
Now, what are you left with? Well, what you're left with is the middle of Jesus' life and his entire ministry and all the miracles he supposedly did. Now, if at the 2 points in his life, we can say with some certitude, I think, that this didn't happen, what epistemic warrant do you have for believing all this stuff in the middle? Like the wedding at Cana, who was there?
There you go.
Like what happened? How do you know? Because like when we've tested Matthew, Mark, Luke and John here and here, we know they failed.
Yeah.
So using some kind of like probability analysis, Bayesian analysis, we can say actually it's very likely that you failed here when we can't verify this.
Especially considering that all these four authors are falsely described as eyewitnesses when they're clearly not. They don't even claim to be. And they make all kinds of mistakes and they know all kinds of things that only an omniscient narrator could know. Like what they were dreaming or what they said in the private meetings of their enemies or Pilate, you know.
I was speaking this weekend to someone that's just sort of not quite Christian anymore. And so talking about like what annoys me is that you go to church. I don't go to church, but if you go to church, the pastor or the priest or the vicar knows a hell of a lot more than the lay people. The congregation, and they know that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are not eyewitnesses, but they never mention this to the lay people. So you get this kind of lay understanding of Christianity that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are the four eyewitness apostles, you know, part of the inner sanctum, and you know X, Y and Z. But none of this is true, and the people that are delivering all this knowledge to you know it's not true, but they're just not telling you. And I think
one of the first times I ever gave a talk about mythicism was at UC Berkeley. And there was a priest in the front row, collar and everything, watching me the whole time like this. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, "They told us all this in seminary at the 40s. You know?
Yeah.
And he was so delighted that
Wow. Yeah. It's like a Disney movie, right? There's the track that the adults get, and then there's the track that the kids watch.
Bingo.
Right.
And
well, I'm not in a rush. If you guys, I mean, you know, we can keep chatting for a bit. I don't know what you guys are.
I've got a little one. Yeah, good.
What time is it over there, Jono?
It's 8:05.
Oh, yeah, very reasonable.
Yeah.
Very reasonable.
I mean, this idea of not caring about literal truth, and then saying I'm a believer anyway. Like, like Hans Kuhn says, none of the particular truths of the Bible are true, but it's helpful for having a proper orientation. I guess Peterson says the same thing, right? None of it's actually true, but humans need myth-level structures, because you should do this because it's the right thing is vacuous, and we want it to bottom out on something like a picture.
But then why this myth? Why this myth then?
Well, here's the thing. It doesn't even matter really which myth are we talking about. Star Trek? Are we talking about Star Wars? Are we talking about, fill in the literary blank that you want to, Winnie the Pooh? If people accept that these things were written as literature, written as fictions with an uplifting purpose, I'm almost more down with that than them trying to say, this all literally happened, you must believe it, or you're an infidel and we must kill you.
Yeah.
It feels like once we accept that there's literary truths and mythical truths as myths themselves, that avoids a lot of problems.
Why that's important is this is like divine command theory, the arguments against divine command theory, which is that why it's important to do that, David, is because you are then evaluating different stories on the basis of moral reasoning. So you're saying, I'm going to pick these myths because actually these myths are the best for delivering these moral teachings, because I know these moral teachings are good because I can do moral philosophy, rather than saying, I've got all these myths from the Bible and I'm going to take them all and that's going to be the vehicle. Yeah, but then what about genocide? What about
this Procrustean bed, you have to throw them all in, and it's like, we need to throw off the bad stuff, but keep all the good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Good Samaritan is absolutely fantastic, and there are loads of morally interesting and good stories from the Bible. But there's also a hell of a lot that's properly wrong. So if that's the myth you're going to take, then I've got huge problems with that. But I think Scott's question is super. This is something I've been I had a massive argument on Facebook some months back with two Christians who I said something about Noah's flood is completely ridiculous, and it's ridiculous for all these reasons. And one of them said, why? And he's a committed Christian, but like a C of E, highfalutin English kind of Christian, which is, well, why are you taking the easy pickings of the Old Testament? It's just pointless to do that. They're obviously not true, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, but where do you stand? What is true then? Why? How do you call yourself? If Jesus is coming and fulfilling every jot and tittle of the law, and which is to say that I am the natural progression of the Old Testament, but you're saying the Old Testament is a load of bullshit, and you're happy to admit that, then what is true? And how do you call yourself a Christian? And what are you, how? If the whole Old Testament is true, I want to know how you can justify still being a Christian.
Right. And
when you get middle-brow literature from the Catholic Church, let's say you're an adult and you want to become a Catholic, there's a whole module of books that they give you. And they start off saying that in the story of the Exodus, the writer falsely places more people belonging to the tribe of Israel than there were members of the entire population at its time. And so it goes down and it says the whole Old Testament is bad, but the New Testament suddenly, these aren't allegorical. This is journalism.
Yes.
But if you're a Jesuit, the whole thing is explained as allegory, and you're an atheist. But you realize, well, this is humans need the death rebirth model is refreshing and therapeutic, and we need to make it historical because otherwise people get scared. And also, when you're scared, you want something like material rabbit foot. And literal interpretation is like a materialism of a sort, isn't it? Because you're saying that it was material back then. So there's a lot more therapeutic comfort value you get out of a fascistically, literally taken belief than out of a fuck. My metaphors aren't helping me right now. The police are after me, or my girlfriend is telling me. And you want something as real as the adrenaline that you're feeling in your bloodstream, so that literalism becomes your friend.
I wonder what Christianity is going to look like when the majority are saying, "Oh yeah, there's no real Jesus," but isn't this wonderful? These beautiful teachings. I'm really fascinated to see how that kind of thing will play out in real life, because
to go back to the Old Testament, though, when you look at someone like Matthew, who is rewriting Jesus as a new Moses, so that, which is to say that Moses has to exist as a person in order for Matthew's theology to make any sense. And Moses is super important. And then you got the Transfiguration. You got all this kind of ideas of like these Old Testament figures that are super important that Jesus is modeling himself on, or the gospel authors are modeling Jesus on. And they're bringing into, the Sermon on the Mount is Moses and the tablets on Mount Sinai or Horeb or whatever. This is just replaying these events in the Old Testament. And if you're saying, well, all these events in the Old Testament are ostensibly false, Moses didn't exist, then I don't know. Well, then none of these allusions, this intertextuality makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the more I dig into the Old Testament, the more I realize that it's not as old as we normally are given to think about either. So it's like, even from the 5th century, 4th century, 6th century, 2nd century, these things are still coming together. And
much later. Are you aware of the Elephantine papyri?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So they're really fascinating. What is it? The 400s BCE. They're these
5th century BCE. 100 years of correspondence between this Jewish mercenary colony in southern Egypt and Jerusalem, among other things, where they're on great terms with the Jerusalem temple, even though they worship 3 gods in their temple. And don't seem to know anything about Moses or David or.
There's not a single mention of any of the patriarchs of the Jewish religion. There's not
none
a
of the
single
names even match up.
Any figures of any story. It's literally so in all of these documents, right, from only as recent as like 450 BCE or whatever. You've got nothing of the Hebrew Bible referenced.
Right.
You've got nothing referenced, right? And then you're saying then the Christian literalists or the Jewish Orthodox is saying, well, these have been around, Moses happened in 1400 BCE or whatever. Right. And you've got all and you had United Monarchy, and then you had all this and this story and then that. Whereas the skeptical exegete will say, actually, these were written in the exilic period when the Israelites were in exile in Babylonia, and then a lot written in a post-exilic period. Then actually the Elephantine papyri back up this notion that actually these stories were invented really, really late, because there would be plenty of opportunity to find them in the Elephantine papyri. And they ain't there.
And we have lots of different traces of that the Old Testament as we know it is a patchwork of different things. But like what we think of as the oldest parts are some of the newest parts. And Russell Gamerkin, I don't know how much you've read of his, but he's
none, but I know I should.
Between all these things that are clearly taken from Plato, and books that were written by Egyptians and Babylonians during the Alexandrian period. And he makes the argument that when they wrote the Septuagint in the year 276 or so, that is also when they wrote the Hebrew original of these scriptures. And those were the Greek and the Hebrew were written at the same time. Which may or may not be true, and I'm still digging into that. But it's fascinating, and it sure answers a lot of things.
There seems to be a lot more sort of scholarship coming out recently to show a much later construction of the Hebrew Bible. For sure, for like a lot of people saying post-exilic. I think it's probably Well, either way, it is late.
Scott, I don't know how much you and Daniel have read of Israel Finkelstein or Neil Asher Silberman's The Bible Unearthed, but that book is amazing. And and their book on David and Solomon is also really fascinating, because they get into all the anachronisms that are in these stories. And I'm actually reading a book right now from an Italian historian named Mario Liberani. It's a book called Israel's History and the History of Israel, and talking about how it played out versus how the historiography of it played out. And
I mean, you've got the Israelites appear to just be the Canaanites, then developing out the Canaanites who then become the enemy, and then it's just it's incredible how much is constructed. You could argue that things like one argument is that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, are just a vehicle to deliver the covenant code, the moral laws of. So the Old Testament is all about, or the Hebrew Bible is all about the moral laws, right? It's like, this is how you should be. It kind of goes back to the idea.
Even in the official story,
apparently Deuteronomy was all discovered during Josiah's reign by a priest who discovered it hidden in the temple. And the thing that fascinates me is it seems like even that story isn't true. But the truth is even worse than that. And that's already sketchy for starters.
When we look at the covenant code, we can find it there in the Unamu, the Code of Hammurabi, the Hittite law codes, all these Lippet Ishtar, all these other legal codes. It's clearly drawing from all of them. So the Bible is not exceptional. It doesn't sit on its own as some kind of like uninfluenced truth. It is drawing from all over. But then when you start looking at things like the Exodus, which is this journey towards the code, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and then the covenant code being delivered, this is all, the Exodus is all about that movement towards that. And you say, well, Moses didn't exist. We've got absolutely no evidence. The birth seems to be stolen off Sargon of Akkad, like being sent down a river in a pitch basket. They didn't have pitch in Egypt at the time, but they had pitch in Mesopotamia. Why would you put a small child in a river full of crocodiles in a basket covered in a good that didn't exist in the area? Well, you've stolen that idea. Why have you stolen it from over there? Because you were in exile there, and you had no national identity. So you're trying to create your national identity.
Bingo.
Propaganda. And in creating this, you're looking at all the stories around you. You say, I love that, I love that, I love that, I love that. Thank you very much. And you create this whole story. And Moses, there might have been a nugget of truth in Moses. He might have been some bloke somewhere that had, but the stories, a bit like Jesus, the stories that we actually find in the Bible will have nothing really to do with that truth. And the Exodus might be to do. We've got the Amana letters, which show like people writing back from a border post to Egypt saying, oh, we've caught like one or two, literally it's like one or two Canaanite slaves escaping over the border. Then you might have a community where you've got like, oh, do you remember Jimmy and Bob who were slaves who escaped back to our community? That over hundreds of years, fish gets bigger and bigger. It becomes an exodus of people, and that might be the nugget of truth.
As atheists, I think we're very tempted to look for that kernel of truth that started the pearl. And the more I get into this, the less I'm tempted to think that there's some nugget of truth behind any of these things. And in fact, the book that just came out, the anthology that Price and Loftus did on the varieties of mythicism, one of the points I make is it's not just Jesus that seems to be completely mythical, but when we look at all the top 10 religions, in top 12 even, if you can add like the Mormons and the Baha'is, they all seem to have completely mythical founder figures right out of the box, right from the get-go. And I'm talking even Western, Eastern, Muhammad, Buddha, all these big ticket items. Even the founder figure of the Sikhs, the Sikh religion is barely 500 years old. It's right around that time. And yet, when you look at the early Sikh history, for instance, it starts with this group of 10 gurus. We don't have any good evidence for anybody except halfway through that list. That's when it starts. We start having good historical grounding for it. And the scriptures aren't even complete until 100 years after that. So it's fascinating to me how incredibly dodgy all the origin stories are for every religion you can picture.
The Hebrew Bible is particularly interesting. I've been researching the heck out of that. I've not done it for a bunch of months because my co-author, who's an archaeologist from Canada, she's had like COVID super bad for like 6 months, and she's like in all sorts of trouble. So I've had to put that on the back burner. But it's genuinely far more interesting than the New Testament, because the New Testament is all about theology, really.
Yeah.
And whereas the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible is all about archaeology and history and contemporary mythology and intertextuality and borrowing from this culture and borrowing from that culture and these kind of mythological stories or like looking for nuggets. It's really, really cool.
It really is. And I love that you bring up all the neighboring cultures, because the more we find out about the Elamites and the Akkadians and the Sumerians, the Babylonians, all those cultures, the more we look into their scriptures and their legal codes, as you mentioned, we see that the Bible is part and parcel of this, and its pantheon was part of these super pantheons, and it's just really interesting legal connectedness.
looking into legal codes, and this is generally true for intertextuality, which is like the reliance of one source on another source. When you look at the legal codes, it's all about. So sometimes Christians or Jews will say, this biblical story can't be relying on that because look at these differences. Whereas it's the wrong way of looking at it. You say this definitely is drawing on that because the similarities are pretty important, but actually what's more important are the differences, because it's the differences that are delivering the meaning. So when you look at like Noah's flood, you're saying, right, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you've got the gods getting really pissed off. Yeah, God's getting pissed off because the humans are making too much noise. Whereas you move that across the Hebrew Bible, and God, single God, is annoyed because of the sins of humanity. So this is an evolution of theology. This is a theological development. It's fascinating, and we get this is the meaning. So the differences is what tells you in the legal codes, where you see them change throughout time and manifesting in the Hebrew Bible covenant codes, for example.
Yeah, and you see them cut and paste the parts they like, and
But to Jonathan's point, though, I like that. That's worth some exploration. Is that where the differences happen? So, like, imagine modern theater where I did a redux of George Bernard Shaw or something, who's already done a redux of, and so now it becomes that individual interpretation of, and it's the difference in the interpretation as the act of art is the artistic expression.
Right.
And so that's where I think we have something to learn, but it's not emphasized, and it's a shame. This is a missed opportunity to celebrate the differences, right?
When you get a film, like a remake of a film, it's like the director will put his own stamp on it, or like will change a little bit because that's what I want the meaning, that's where I'm going to drive what I'm trying to say by changing this up, or not even like a film that you might pay homage to some other film rather than being a remake of it. Like, you're paying homage to these films, but I'm going to warp this into my own meaning because it's the difference. It's what my stamp is the difference.
And even taking Romeo and Juliet, turning it into West Side Story, that kind of thing. And the Hebrew authors were doing that in the Old Testament. The Greek Christian authors were doing that in the New Testament. We can trace the development of all these things. And what's fascinating for me is that it just doesn't end. It keeps going into Zoroastrianism. It goes into Egyptian. It goes all these directions and these roots that we would never think of normally. And it's just such a collaborative art project, everything.
It's almost a shame when you get, and this happened to some degree with the Hebrew Bible, as they kind of like universalized the Hebrew Bible at whatever point in time they did a little bit, really very late. And with the Council of Nicaea, it's like you're then like freezing in time this book or this, and you're making a snapshot. And you're saying this now has to last as it is forever, and you don't get to see how it would have evolved because I don't know enough about the early movements and the non-canonical texts that were hanging around. You have all these different Jesus sects at the time having these different ideas of who Jesus was and what the stories were, and Jesus as a kid killing another kid and stuff like that. And you're like, whoa, that's mental. But that didn't make it, and because they said, right, we're gonna make a canon of the stuff that's in, and everything else is out. And it's like, whoa, but they were genuine. That represents a community of people believing this stuff.
Right.
It's crazy to think it was.
And what we have left, both the Bible and the extra canonical stuff that we have, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's like I would love to know what else was written in the early on and how much is different from what we have taken it to mean.
People like Marcion,
the redactions, the interpretations.
Yeah, you got people like Marcion and all these other people, also like the critical Jews at the time. So we only hear about them by the early church fathers because they destroyed everything that was like heretical or attacking.
Yeah, we only know this stuff from the Lee Strobels and the Josh McDowells of the first century. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's such a shame. So we hear about like Celsus or Celsus through contra Celsus or contra Celsum or whatever, however it is. You only hear about it by the church fathers responding to it. Well, I'd love to see that original attack on Christianity. That would be fascinating.
And the frustrating thing is, even if like Paul wrote an extra copy of his letter, put it in a vault, and we just discovered it today, we would have no idea that we were looking at the original letter, because it would just be another weird textual variant, for us. And we have 150 to 200 years where we have no way of verifying how these things really read, and all kinds of evidence to support the fact that every single Christian faction felt free to make corrections as needed.
It's like
it feels to me. I was going to say, it feels to me like on a top level sort of viewpoint, it seems to me like a big editorial job. It's like, get your essays in by this particular time, and by essays I mean, look, where are the pagan truths, the moralists? What do we want to draw on? Let's try and put something together. So, well, what's the function of a canon? The function of the canon is that we
is to put a cap on that.
Well, we got to put a cap on it. But we're also in charge for curriculum development, right? And all these like modern uses, but like, and I'm not saying that it's antithetical with anything that's benevolent. I mean, they're trying to. We got a job to do here. We don't have the same reality that they did I guess that turn, I guess, from BCE to CE. We're not living in a Roman time. We have information abundance, right? It's like we don't have to put a limit on what we're experiencing in terms of documents and documentations and stories. But when it's a top-down approach, and that's the way that you communicate with your public, I mean, eventually you have to draw the line and say, well, we have this information and we got to make this logically coherent. And we
have to harmonize it all together too.
So a really good example of it.
That they still haven't quite ironed out all the bugs, because we still see the traces of them. And then you've got something like the Nag Hammadi Gospels that were hidden away and never meant to be exposed to the light of day. And yet when we look at them, these are Christian monks hiding these writings, taking pagan writings, turning them into Christian writings, and almost none of it is anything like what we recognize as Christianity at all.
But I think that's beautiful. If you're saying the idea of Christianity, I think is beautiful, right? I mean, okay, so from a continuation of a Hellenic tradition of the sun god basically being embodied into like a dominating Alexander the Great, right? Rather than making that our hero, which is really an extension of Odysseus and the Homer epics, right? You're going to sit there and say, well, we want to make a universal God that is, focused on love and harmony, right? As opposed, so I can understand, the value in that and trying to engineer that. But it's somehow just a response to me to a Hellenic and Judaic tradition, really. And one thing I want to run by you guys is that think about the definition of the self. Okay, you're going to love this, Jonathan, with the philosopher in you. So the definition of the self, from a biological standpoint, has a lot to do with this transition between pleasure and pain, right? So, and look at models from Damasio of consciousness. This is kind of where I'm heading. But we have this very distinct ability to be able to say, I'm an individual because of what I actually, can experience in terms of me versus everything else other than me, right?
Yeah.
Because I have this biological barrier. But when you have a Judaic tradition or self comes to mind. Antonio's my man. So when you have these artificial barriers that start to form, say in a Judaic tradition, I think the response, which was Christian, the Christian response is like, hey, well, the rest of us want this. This is amazing. This is really cohesive. There's a lot of benefits to this us group, and we're not part of the us group. So here's us making our own us group, which then is the offshoot of the Muslim faith. And then what it actually, I had this interview probably about a year and a half ago with a fellow from Iran, Muslim guy. And basically, I mean, I got to a really interesting point of psychology with him, understanding that he believes in this because it's so integral into his personhood that giving it up changes who he is.
So right.
It's just one more thing. It's like a defense of culture. And so if you eliminate it, you somehow wash away the distinction of the us. No longer we elevate it as the people or the son of, like the followers of Jesus. Like we're the chosen, or, the chosen people from the Judaic tradition. Or
this puts us back in the same boat with everybody now. We're not special that way.
Not so much the fear of God, which everybody seems to be, this is the existentialist sort of crisis and everything. I don't really buy that entirely that much. It just seems to be the strengthening of the us versus them, saying, I want to be a part of an us.
So it's all about psychology, religion, all belief. It's all about psychology. It's not really the content isn't important. It's why you believe it. You're not going to reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. So you've got to understand why people believe in things. And in terms of just a little bit of what you're talking about there it is about tribalism and us and them and identity. But it's also, interestingly, things like, so the question is, when you're arguing with a young earth creationist about the age of the earth, right, and you're presenting them with knockdown evidence of why the earth is clearly older than 6,000 years old, right, why don't they believe you? And the reason why they don't believe you is because when you are giving them rational evidence against their position, you're not arguing about the age of the earth. This is called terror management theory and mortality salience. You are arguing about, or what you're doing is you're giving them existential threat. Yeah. So you're saying that if you believe that the earth isn't 6,000 years old, then you are no longer going to be able to access eternity in paradise. So in fact, what I'm doing is, so what people do, terror management theory is about building up worldviews that assuage your death anxiety. So it's like my mortality is something that is giving me existential threat as a background thing. So if I create, so religions are about, and cultures are about creating these networks of ideas that assuage my anxiety over death. So if someone then comes up and challenges my worldview,
they're trying to kill you. Yeah,
they are basically challenging my access to immortal life, and they're challenging my immortality. There's no wonder they ain't going to believe you. It doesn't come about this rational evidence of butting up against each other. Well, my evidence clearly is better than your evidence. It's like, but if your evidence is better than my evidence, then I don't get to live in paradise forever, so you can fuck off.
Right. And I think all believers know that at some deep animal level, but they would never make the connection that that's what they're doing.
No, this is all subconscious. Yeah.
Well, which is why it is interestingly pluralistic, right? Heaven is including, it's a eusocial extension, right? Even though it's not the same experience, we know it's not the same experience. I mean, even if we give them that it's a separate experience, we can't experience it. We don't take it with us. Yeah. And it's not a two-way street. It's not even a one-way street. It's a they're two separate categories, right? Regardless, it's two separate categories. But there's the assurance that you're going to be there with the other people in relation to you, which is the one commonality, right? Is that you're in this other place in relation with other people. There's not a heaven where you're there by yourself, or you come up with your own individual heaven that has nothing to do with the tradition.
But it can have nothing to do with it. I mean, I think what heaven is functional. Heaven and hell are functional. So they if you are aware of just world theory, just world theory is like, why does bad stuff happen to good people? So the reason why heaven and hell developed in the intertestamental period were that the Hellenized Jews were oppressing other Jewish communities, and the Jewish communities are like, well, we're the chosen people of God. Why is it that we're getting crap? And then they're like, the Hellenized Jews are crapping on us. Well, what's going on here? So that how do we understand this? Well, if we had immortal souls that can transcend this corporeal life, then actually those bad people that are screwing us over can go to hell forever, and we can go to heaven forever. And that means the world is now just, because before we had this understanding, the world wasn't just, and we have to have this just world theory. And so heaven and hell, in my opinion, are merely mechanisms to achieve a just world.
Mm-hmm. And it's worth pointing out too that there are also evolved ideas, that these went from simpler ideas where there was no idea of immortal souls, or it was an afterlife that was pretty much very boring for good and the bad. And it wasn't until they bumped into like the Babylonians and the Zoroastrians, they got these ideas that we think of as bedrock Judaism, but nope, it's actually Babylonian, and any number of others.
Which just adds to my position that it's an epiphenomenal, extension or projection, right? It's completely man-made, right? Just like, Jonathan was saying before, it's like, all of our concepts would fizzle away to nothing. And so from that Greek language animal position, to say, well, that's fundamentally what it is. It's it's an exercise in Babel, or sorry, in Barbar. I mean, right?
Well, yeah, I think you said what you said, and I thought it made sense too.
Yeah,
but religion is these are just all ideas that have psychological function. So when we move into a post-religious world or a post-God world, it's useful to understand what function God has for religious people, because we are going to need to replace, either we get rid of that function entirely because actually it's outdated or whatever.
Yeah.
Or so, for example, if you say attribution, so how do we understand that we don't understand how the world works? Well, God did it. Okay, we can do away with that idea, but we can say either we don't know, but we're pretty damn sure it's going to be a naturalistic explanation, or we say here's a naturalistic explanation, or we have to replace some of those functions with a better secular version. Like, we need to understand why you are holding on to these religious ideas that are ostensibly wrong, because if we don't understand why you're believing them, then we're going to really struggle to overcome that in a post-God society.
The Myth of Jesus with David Fitzgerald.